Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft & Tailored, and in this week's episode of What Is On My Wrist, we're talking about a Seiko Diver nicknamed the Captain Willard. The reference is 6105-8110. It's an awesome dive watch, has a ton of history. It's a very popular watch, and I've been wearing these watches a lot. I've been collecting them for a long time. This is an exceptional example, so I figured we'd talk about it in this week's episode of What Is On My Wrist. All right, so the watch itself is definitely a unique piece. What's interesting is that although Seiko watches might not be the most luxurious watches, they might not have like the brand prestige such as Rolex or Omega or Omega for my friends that are across a pond and down under. The watch build quality is awesome, and these watches. I'm a big fan of Seiko watches. Matter of fact, I've done a couple of videos on other Seiko watches that are in my collection. I really love them, and specifically the 6105-8110 is definitely one of my favorites. So even though the watch doesn't have that brand prestige, and even though they're accessible and affordable, what's interesting is that a lot of discerning and diehard collectors have them in their collection. So the Seiko, and specifically Seiko dive watches, receive a lot of love from the vintage enthusiast community, and for good reason. There's a specific kind of satisfaction that comes from wearing a Seiko, and I think that there's almost like this sense of being kind of a part of a club. When you wear a Seiko, you could be in line grabbing a cup of coffee, and the guy in front of you could be wearing a Seiko, and you know that either he's a watch guy or he's a guy that has attention to detail and knows a thing or two about a thing or two. I think that Seiko, even though again it's accessible, definitely has a bit of a cult-like following, and you're definitely a dude that is in the know, a guy or gal rather, that is in the know if you're into Seiko watches. The other cool thing about Seiko watches is that there's a long line of history and heritage with these watches that you also get with other brands like, let's say, Rolex or Omega. I'm not comparing Seiko to necessarily Rolex or Omega, but what's interesting is that in order for a watch to be iconic and collectible and cool, it doesn't have to have a marquee brand name. It can be something as kind of utilitarian and or as accessible as a Seiko for it to be desirable, and also worthy of even the most discerning collector's wrist. The Seiko 6105-8110 actually replaced Seiko's first diver, the 62 Moss, in 1968. And the watch was in production until 1977. So the watch had a pretty long production range. What's also interesting is that the watch has the nickname, the Captain Willard. Martin Sheen's character in the 1979 Francis Ford Coppola film Apocalypse Now actually wore one of these watches, and it kind of has taken on the name the Captain Willard. These watches were worn on the wrists of US service members, especially Navy SEALs, UDT divers, Green Berets, the Spec Op guys, and the forward advisors in Vietnam, for actually a pretty good reason. And Captain Willard in the film Apocalypse Now wore one, and was very fitting that he wore this watch in the film, because our service members in that time period were wearing these watches. And the reason for that is Seiko watches were very robust. They're built like tanks. It's a dive watch, so a lot of these guys were in and out of the water. Vietnam was a very harsh and kind of wet environment, and these watches were actually sold in the PXs overseas during the Vietnam conflict. So these watches were definitely accessible. They were at a consumable price point, and they offered a rugged tool-like build quality that allowed them to withstand the harsh conditions of that war zone and that kind of climate of that time. So you'll see a lot of these in photos of soldiers in Vietnam, and see them on the wrists of those soldiers in Vietnam, and for good reason. So the watch measures 44 millimeters across, so it's a 44 millimeter watch in diameter, but when it's on the wrist, it doesn't wear overbuilt, it doesn't wear like a large watch, it actually wears quite nicely. Even as you can see on my wrist, it doesn't look oversized. It looks like a tool watch, it's definitely a dive watch, but It doesn't wear like a Panerai or something like that. Even though it's 44 millimeters, I think that sizing is kind of deceiving because we've got these integrated crown guards in this asymmetrical case. So this asymmetrical case was the first case that Seiko decided to design to provide a little bit more protection to the crown, and they kind of built this asymmetrical kind of like funky turtle-esque type of case. So this is the original, or the OG turtle, so to speak. Another feature of the watch is that the watch was originally supplied on both a bracelet and, more commonly, what they call a waffle-style rubber dive strap. So this is a rubber dive strap. Shout out to the good dudes over at Uncle Seiko. If you don't know of Uncle Seiko, you should definitely check them out. I'll provide a link in the description below, but they make really awesome reproduction and quality replacement straps for various Seiko watches. So the original straps, when you find these in either new old stock condition or kind of out in the wild, the straps have a tendency to not really be rubber anymore. They kind of turn into like this hard plastic. Uncle Seiko makes a really nice recreation, and this is an Uncle Seiko strap, even down to like the shape and size of the buckle. But the lug width on this watch is 19 millimeters, which is kind of unique, being that the watch probably could accommodate a 20 millimeter strap and would wear nicely on a 20 millimeter strap, but it looks really nice on this 19, whereas I think 18 would be too small, 20 might look a little bit weird. 19 seems to fit this watch nicely. And again, this is a really nice quality reproduction that would have been what the original ones would have come on. It's kind of like almost like a tropic style strap. The watch features a bi-directional bezel, meaning that it goes both ways, and there is a click spring in the bezel, which is nice. Another thing too that you kind of see more on like the Omega Seamaster 300s and the mill subs is a fully gradiated bezel. So you have hash marks in between, the minute markings on the outer bezel, and it's a really nice chunky bezel. You could definitely operate this bezel with gloves on, and it definitely has a solid, feel to the bezel. The other unique feature to the watch is that it has a locking crown, but it's not really a screw down crown. So it's got this interesting kind of push and lock mechanism. So basically you unlock it from the case. I'll do that here, maybe. There we go. You unlock it from the case, and then you can move it into the quick set date setting position, or into the time setting position, and then you basically push that crown back down, and then it locks back onto the case. So the 6105-8110 is powered by the Seiko 6105B movement. What's interesting is Seiko movements in many cases correlate to the reference number. So 6105 is actually the movement, or the 6105B is actually the movement that powers the 6105-8110. Another little fact too is that the movement is a 17 jewel movement. It's an automatic movement, but you can't wind the movement. Through more of the stereotypical pull the crown out and wind the movement, there's actually only two positions of the crown. So when the crown is out and off the lock position, you have the setting position. And then the other nice feature is that you have, it's also hacking too, which I think is really, really cool. So again, going back to kind of, these watches were used for military applications in many cases. Synchronizing watches, you can actually do that because the movement is hacking. And then in the secondary position, what you have is, in the first position rather, if I can get it here, you can actually quickly set the date. So it's a quick set hacking automatic movement, which is really cool, but it is not a windable movement. The way that you would actually wind the movement is actually by shaking the watch, or through what we would call like kinetic, type of movement. So if you set the watch down, it wasn't running, the way that you would charge the mainspring or power the watch is by shaking it around, essentially. So really interesting watch. I really like these watches a lot. This specific example is really, really nice. You actually have to be careful when buying these watches. For whatever reason, and I think maybe due to the fact that these watches were and still are very accessible, a lot of times you'll see a replacement or non-genuine dial in these watches, so you have to be careful with that. Another thing that is often the case when looking at these watches on the secondary market, as they're all vintage, so they're all in the secondary market, but the lume has a tendency to go black. Seiko is using a tritium lume, but for whatever reason, I don't know if it was due to maybe moisture or water damage or whatever, but the lume in the hands and in the lume plots on the dial can actually go black. The dial format is very interesting as well. You have you know, a steel marker that is essentially luminous filled, similar to like, let's say like a white gold surround on a Rolex or something like that. But again, these watches first were introduced in 1968 and kind of had that more modern kind of dial layout, which aids in visibility. So this specific example is a really, really nice example, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to feature it in what is on my wrist, because finding one like this is kind of becoming challenging. There definitely is a cult-like following for these watches, so when they come up for sale, they typically sell pretty quickly because guys are looking for them. And again, I think that there's that iconic nature to the piece. They're nice to wear. It's a watch that you can also easily, you know, get serviced and you know, have a pressure test, which is kind of cool and nice. The only downside to this watch is that Seiko uses a crystal that's called Hardlex, and you can't buff out the crystal. So it's kind of their own proprietary crystal, which is very hard. It's soft. It's rather much harder than, let's say, like Hesalite or the acrylics that like Omega or Rolex or the other brands use. But the only bummer is that when you do scratch it, you can't bring that scratch out because it's not really like an acrylic. It's kind of their own Hardlex type of clear plastic. So you'll see a lot of these watches in the wild that have just completely destroyed crystals, but they do make a bunch of really nice replacement crystals. And I believe Seiko actually still OEMs the crystal for this. In any case, really, really nice example. I'll provide a link in the description below. And I'm working on an article that talks about the history of the 6105 and specifically in the 8110. There's a couple of different variants. So once that's completed, I'll pop a link in the description below as well. So be sure to click the link below to check this guy out and to learn more about the Seiko 6105-8110. Really interesting watch. And like always, guys, be sure to follow us on Instagram and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I will see you in the next one.